In the first chapter of In the Footsteps of Our Ancestors, you are introduced to our main character and taken on a long and captivating journey with Nicolai, Severin, Vilhelm, Jensen, Harlev, later known as William Harlev. He was a young lad from the Jutland countryside in Denmark who ended up becoming a renowned construction magnate in Chicago. His life story is so extraordinary that it should be written as an epic novel rather than reality. Our tale commences in 1837 when Nicolai was born at Vilhelm School in Viborg County. Nicolai was an ambitious young man with a thirst for adventure running in his blood. He stood out significantly from other young men from the countryside who typically didn't achieve much in life, neither in terms of education nor by venturing far from their home county. But Nicolai had big dreams and ambitions, and he wanted much more from life, which he achieved through both adversity and success, with honesty and a touch of cunning. But more about that later. Let's begin with Nicolai's parents. His father was Jens Anders Harlev, born in 1786 in Harlev Parish in Aarhus County, and his mother was Elsa Katrina Henningsdottir, born in 1800 in Hagebrug in Viborg County. Nicolai's father, Jens, also stood apart in his own way, as his father was a day laborer, which means he was a casual worker in agriculture, whereas Jens became a school teacher. It's possible that he became a teacher because he didn't have many other options. In 1801, the census rolls stated that he was unfit for military service due to being physically weak, which back then meant in poor physical condition. Please note that work on a farm or in any other trade during that time occurred under very different conditions than today, as they didn't have machines or other tools to ease labor and spare the body. Many people in Jens's situation, who were unable to do hard physical work, often ended up in poorhouses. However, in 1820, Jens got a temporary position in Hinge near Viborg as an unskilled school teacher and church singer, and there he met Elsa, who was a maid on a farm. Their meeting led to Elsa becoming pregnant in 1823, and in a rush they got married in January 1824. In May of the same year, the newlyweds and expectant couple moved to Virum, where they settled at Virum School, located right next to the church. Virum was a small parish with around 400 inhabitants, situated about 16 kilometers south of Viborg. Here, Jens had secured a stable position as a school teacher and church singer from 1824 to 1845, educating rural children from ages 6 to 14, when school concluded with confirmation. In addition to school, children also carried out their duties at home, serving as important labor. Many children only had classes every other day due to practical reasons, especially for farmers' children, and they were also exempt from school during the harvest season. After completing their schooling around the age of 14, children usually began working on other farms, either in the same parish or in nearby areas. If they started working before the age of 14, it was the responsibility of the farm owner to ensure they still attended school, and then they worked after school hours. A teacher could instruct up to 50 students at once. The impact of education was substantial. It's estimated that nearly the entire population of the Kingdom of Denmark could read in the 1830s. Due to Jens's role as a school teacher, it's highly likely that Nicolai received extra education compared to many other children. Additionally, Nicolai was curious and eager to learn, and he was a gifted boy. Jens taught at Vilhelm School until 1845. He was described as a small, frail, and weak man, but a skilled teacher. Like all other children, Jens and Elsa's 9 children also went into service shortly after their confirmation. And as previously mentioned, it was common for farmers' children to work on a farm, while urban children typically worked in factories, with a 10-hour workday. Children under 10 were only allowed to work 4 to 6 hours in addition to regular school hours. But fortunately, this changed in 1873, when children under 10 were no longer allowed to work in factories. But in January 1848, Nicolai's father dies of consumption, an older term for tuberculosis, and just a month later, Nicolai's younger brother Otto Valentin also dies, only 6 years old, from dropsy, which is an abnormal accumulation of fluid in tissues or body cavities. After Nicolai's father's death, Else and the children are allowed to remain at the school, but it wasn't easy for Else to support the 4 young children alone. Therefore, in the spring of 1848, when Nicolai was 11 years old, he was sent to his maternal uncle Carl Wilhelm's place in Severin in Ringkøbing County, 40 kilometers northwest of Vilhelm. At the farm named Raunholt, Else's younger brother Carl lived with his wife Annie and their 2 young children and a hired hand. After school, Nicolai helped with carpentry work, gaining significant experience with cutting logs using a large saw. Nicolai always stood at the bottom end, so he got sawdust in his eyes, as he later recounted. With his uncle, he received a practical, old-fashioned upbringing that would serve him well throughout his life. Nicolai later proved to be a practical man who not only was willing to work hard, but also demanded the same of others. After his confirmation in Severin in 1852, Nicolai, now 14 years old, made his way to Skive, 20 kilometers north of Severin, where he had secured an apprenticeship as a mercantile clerk, a position that was then also referred to as a commercial assistant. Here, Nicolai learned all the secrets of being a mercantile clerk under the guidance of merchant Frederick Christian Behrens, located at Adelgade number 18, and he worked there until around 1857. Now we need to fast forward a few years to May 1893. On the front page of the Danish newspaper, the Daily News, there's an article sourced from an American newspaper about Nicolai, in which he states, and I quote, that in 1857, after completing his apprenticeship, he was struck by American fever and traveled to America. That same fall, he landed in Quebec and then sailed to Chicago, which at that time was still in its early stages of becoming a metropolis. In the winter, he continued his journey by horse-drawn wagon west to Minnesota, where the pioneers of civilization were few and far between, scattered in the vast forests, and where there were 10 Native Americans for every white man. He also tells of lending his rifle to an Indian who went hunting. His traveling companions were very much against it, but William trusted that the Indian wouldn't abuse his kindness, and indeed he returned after the hunt with the rifle, even sharing his catch with him. In these surroundings, he began as a lumberjack, but soon realized that it wasn't that occupation that would make him a millionaire. That's why he started a construction business, taking small contracts for the railroads that were extending their iron arms further and further west. He built station buildings and warehouses along the tracks that passed through the small towns slowly emerging. In 1859, his eldest son Alfred was born in Minnesota, he said. However, Nicolai chose to send Alfred to Denmark so that he could receive a good upbringing and the best education there. Well, I have to interrupt here because it is not entirely correct. That he traveled to America in 1857 cannot be completely dismissed, but he must certainly have returned to Denmark a year later because his son Alfred was actually born in Denmark and not America. More precisely, he was born in Skive on May 22nd, 1859, and you don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure out that Nicolai must have been in Denmark in September 1858. However, the reason Nicolai claimed to have already emigrated to America in 1857, his acquaintance with the pioneers, the Indians, his time as a lumberjack, and as a station builder might have been enough to embellish his CV and perhaps give him more and better advantages in America in the long run. Back then, there wasn't much oversight over when one arrived in America. It also wasn't necessarily registered when or how many children one had. People just went in and reported it when they happened to pass by the registration office. Education credentials didn't necessarily need to be on paper either. One just had to be good at what they did. However, as an American citizen, one always had more rights and opportunities, which might be why Nicolai claimed that his son Alfred was born in America. But we need to go back to Denmark because the truth is, While Nicolai was still working in Skive at merchant Frederick Christian Baron's place, he met the young girl Hulda Marie Magdalene Luder. Hulda was born in Fredericia in 1835 and had moved to Skive with her parents and siblings around 1856 when her father got a position as a customs officer. She became pregnant, and here in Skive, Nicolai's son Alfred Georg Victor Luder was born in 1859. It probably wasn't in Nicolai's plans to start a family already, and he might not have been particularly in love with Hulda either, because before Alfred was born, Nicolai had moved to the bigger city Viborg to work. It should be added that he didn't completely abandon them, as he ensured their well-being. But Nicolai didn't stay in Viborg for long, as later that year, he was conscripted into the 3rd Dragoon Regiment in Aarhus and was quartered at the garrison hospital at Frederiksgade, number 39. In a note in the census rolls, Nicolai was described as a good rider, sober, but it wasn't recommended that he serve as a substitute. On the opposite end of Frederiksgade, at number 9, lived the young seamstress Karen Marie Olsen, who was born in Cold Parish, Aarhus County, in February 1837. Karen Marie fell for the young, handsome dragoon, and the two quickly became a couple. As I mentioned at the beginning, Nicolai had aspirations for his life, and he likely thought there would be more opportunities in Copenhagen. So after his first period in the Dragoon Regiment in Aarhus, Nicolai and Karen Marie traveled to the capital. At the same time, Karen Marie became pregnant, and in September 1860, the couple got married at St. Paul's Church, and the newlyweds moved into Blankogade, number 18. Nicolai had found work as a marker, a person who marks, such as in billiards by keeping track of points, or in darts by indicating where the dart hit. Presumably, he worked at a tavern because at the end of 1860, he applied for a permit to establish himself as an innkeeper, but his application was rejected. Nonetheless, an advertisement appeared in the newspaper on the 2nd of November, 1860, and I quote, "Notice, my establishment on the corner of Blankogade and Norgesgade, formerly run as a tavern, I have now handed over to Mr. William Harlev, and hereby convey my most cordial thanks to the public for the goodwill shown to me. Signed, J.P. Poulsen." I think that Nicolai likely received the license shortly after, since the census rolls noted that he was a tavern keeper. But please now note that here Nicolai has changed his name to Wilhelm Harlev, so don't be confused when I refer to him as Wilhelm from now on. On the 5th of January, Karen Marie gives birth to a daughter, but Karen Marie dies already the next day, and the day after that, their newborn daughter Wilhelmina also dies. In the church register, it's noted that Karen Marie died of puerperal fever and Wilhelmina died of convulsions. Wilhelm places an advertisement in the newspaper, which reads, "Sunday the 6th of January, I had to endure the heavy fate of being deprived of my dearly beloved, diligent wife, Karen Marie Harlev, born Olsen, who after a painful illness passed away into eternity, taking her little newborn child with her." Below it is written, Wilhelm Harlev, on the corner of Norgesgade and Blankogade. The funeral will take place at the Garrison Church on Thursday, the 10th of January at 12 o'clock. Nicolai was conscripted into the military again in Aarhus on the 2nd of April, 1861, and was there until June of the same year. But otherwise, he continued to run his tavern at Blankogade number 18. At number 10 on the same street, lived a German photographer and lithographer named August Burchardi, and I believe he may have influenced Wilhelm's next adventure. August Burchardi might have visited Wilhelm's tavern, and over a beer or wine, told him about his profession, piquing Wilhelm's curiosity and teaching him about the trade. Along the way, you will experience that Wilhelm was a versatile artist, because whatever he set his mind to, he accomplished it. In February 1862, Wilhelm places an advertisement in the newspaper stating, "2 large mahogany mirrors, a billiard table with accessories, a mahogany buffet with shelves, suitable for a confectioner, are offered for sale from the corner of Blankogade in the basement." It seems that Wilhelm has plans as he is selling off his inventory, and suddenly he has also moved from the address on Blankogade, because in the newspaper in August 1862, one can read that Wilhelm is wanted because he has not shown up for his military service and cannot be found at his address on Blankogade. Well, it's because he's moved to Örebro in Sweden. In the book From Bergslag and Bondebug, 1968, William Harlev's stay in Sweden is mentioned in the period 1862 to 1864, and it says, below Ixhamartorget to the east, next to the narrow and winding Handwerkerregatten, lay some empty plots owned by the bell ringer Adolf Ferdinand Hedden near the Nicolai church, and here, almost on the outskirts of the town, a glass house studio was built in the autumn of 1862 for photographer William Harlev from Copenhagen, which studio was still standing in its original location as late as 1964. It was completed and inaugurated for its purpose on Wednesday, the 17th of December, 1862, and despite the darkest season being the most unsuitable for starting a photographic studio, Harlev succeeded with his diligence in the studio's construction to achieve respectable results. Quote ends. Wilhelm travels frequently back and forth to Denmark, as he had met the young Thora Caroline Brask in Copenhagen, and on the 18th of June 1863, they were married at Helsingergade No. 4, in Thora's flat and with a royal dispensation. A royal dispensation was a permission given by the king to the applicants, among other, marriage at home instead of in the church. After the marriage, Wilhelm takes his Thora with him to Sweden and continues his work as a photographer. Continuing in the book From Bergslag and Bondebug, and please excuse my bad Swedish, it further states, by his side he had his wife Thora with technical assistance, and also director J. Peterson from Copenhagen, who kept the studio running in the summer months when Harlev was often in Mariestad to take photographs or was traveling. Wilhelm often places advertisements in the newspaper Nerikes Allehanda, where in December 1862 it said, photographic studio. The undersigned hereby kindly informs that we have come to the town to offer photography as soon as the studio, which has begun in Klokker Hayden's garden, is completed, which will happen at the beginning of next week. Wilhelm Harlev and Company from Copenhagen. Or in July 1863, again in Nerikes Allehanda, photography. The undersigned, who has now returned from a trip abroad and has brought back various new things, including an apparatus for instant photography, Wilhelm Harlev. Wilhelm enjoyed taking pictures of nature and buildings, but primarily he created portrait pictures, and he did it quite well, as you can see from his pictures, considering that it's been 150 years since he made them. Continuing in the book, it says, after 6 months, Harlev had already recognized the value of further education, and therefore he traveled abroad in the spring of 1863 to study. He brought back from his trip an apparatus for instant photography and an apparatus that enlarges a regular visiting card to a size of 8 feet in height and 6 feet in width, which is approximately 180 by 240 centimeters. A very interesting photography task was carried out in September 1863, where we both have a picture and know the photographer. The photographer was Wilhelm Harlev, and the subject was the Örebro County Council, in front of the camera in the Grand Salon of the Örebro Hotel. And a stereoscope image could subsequently be bought for 1 riksdaler and 50 öre. Quote ends. However, over time, Wilhelm has to place several advertisements referring to people who picked up but had not paid for their portraits a long time ago, and he kindly asked them to pay before the 1st of January, 1864. Otherwise, the bill will be sent to collections. On the 27th of the same month, the newspaper reads, discontinued. As I am engaged elsewhere during parts of the winter months, I hereby announce that my outstanding debts for photographic portraits and stereoscope cards will be managed by Mr. Alfred Wisteleu by the end of this month. Wilhelm Harlev. In February, the Mariestad's Ugeblad newspaper writes that Wilhelm Harlev, here in the town, has established a photographic studio at Mr. K. Kielbaum's farm. But we already have 2. Wilhelm places another advertisement and addresses customers with unpaid bills, while also offering discounts for new portrait photography. He suddenly becomes very busy trying to collect money, and in May 1864, he goes bankrupt. He apparently owes money himself, as one reads in the newspaper in September 1864 that the gentlemen listed below are indebted for unpaid bills, including Mr. William Harlev, an amount of 56 Rigsdaler. But Wilhelm and Tora were gone, because in 1865, Wilhelm finally took the long journey across the Atlantic to America with Thora, and perhaps this time they took the route previously described, from Europe to Quebec in Canada, and then by sea to Chicago, and from there, either by horse-drawn carriage or train, the roughly 500 kilometers northwest to Winona, Minnesota. The New World. European immigrants settled in the Winona, Minnesota area in about 1851 and established the town in stages in 1852 and 1853. The original settlers were immigrants from New England, and the population rose from 815 in December 1855 to 3,000 in December 1856. In 1856, German immigrants also arrived, and Germans and Americans worked together to plant trees and build businesses based on timber, wheat, steamships, and railways. Here, Wilhelm and Tora settled in 1865 with all their photographic equipment because Wilhelm wanted to start his adventure as a photographer here. Now, not to confuse you even more, but Wilhelm changed his name again, from Wilhelm to William, because it sounded more American. On January 3, 1866, the Minnesota German Staatszeitung published the following announcement. European artist, something new in this country. The undersigned William Harlev, who has just arrived from Europe and has been engaged in the art of photography for several years in northwestern Europe, especially in the cities of Hamburg, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Christiania, honors the residents of Winona and southern Minnesota by announcing that he has settled in this city with the purpose of conducting a photographic business with all its latest improvements, and since he has brought instruments that cannot be found in America, he is convinced that his photographs cannot be surpassed by other artists. He has an instrument that captures the image in no time, which is especially suitable for photographing children. The public is kindly requested to come and evaluate his work. The studio is located on the 3rd floor of Simpson's Block in Winona. It is guaranteed that the work will be satisfactory and payment of his fee is expected. 374 Winona, William Harlev. But the business did not go as expected for him. Perhaps the town had too few inhabitants willing to be photographed, and he realized it wasn't a good business. So they traveled about 200 kilometers further west to the slightly larger town of Mankato, still in the state of Minnesota. Before migrants settled in Mankato, the Sioux Indians originally lived there. And in 1862, driven to desperation by crop failure and hunger, the Indians attacked isolated farms, and in just a few weeks, more than 500 civilians, soldiers, and Dakota Indians were killed. And on December 26, 1862, the United States Volunteers of the state of Minnesota carried out the largest mass execution in American history in Mankato. 38 Sioux Indians were hanged here for their involvement in war crimes committed during the uprising. The crimes included intentional murder, mutilation, and rape of hundreds of unarmed civilians. A USV military court reviewed nearly 500 cases, of which 303 received a death sentence. But President Lincoln requested the records, reviewed them, placed rape cases on top, and pardoned 265 Sioux Indians. Here in the town, about 3 years after the uprising, William started a small trading business. And on August 10, 1866, they had a son named William Harlev Jr. I would like to briefly explain why the Danes emigrated to America. Between 1820 and 1930, nearly 336,000 Danes went to America. They constituted a small splash in a global wave of 38 million immigrants heading for America. The majority of Danes left after 1867, Some left for religious reasons, including a few hundred Baptists from the 1800s and early 1900s. In 1900, Danish-American Baptists numbered around 4,000 individuals. During the same decades, a much larger number of Mormons emigrated, nearly 17,000 in total. Other Danes left for political reasons, but the vast majority of Danish emigrants left for economic reasons. The Danish emigration wave was primarily driven by the immigrants' perception of greater economic opportunities in America than in Denmark. Between 1801 and 1900, Denmark's population more than doubled, from 0.9 million to 2.4 million. The population growth strained the economy, but not as severely as in neighboring countries like Norway and Sweden. In the mid-1800s and 1880s, agriculture shifted from grain cultivation to animal production as international competition in grain increased and prices fell. This economic development in Denmark simply couldn't keep up with population growth. Especially in the mid-1800s and 1880s, it was challenging. In rural areas, the growing number of large families led many young men and women from the farming and tenant farmer classes to risk becoming permanently landless. There simply wasn't enough land for everyone. At the same time, news of the vast opportunities in America spread. In the mid-1800s and 1880s, there was still plenty of land available for young Danish men and women who had given up the dream of owning a farm at home. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, offering free land to settlers in the West. More affluent immigrants could buy land from states or railroad companies. There was more choice and often better market access here. Better wages and employment opportunities in America also enticed the Danes. While the tendency toward overpopulation in Denmark led to lower wages, the high demand for more labor in America resulted in higher wages. In the mid-1800s, the Danish wage level was only about a third of the American wage level, and even in the early 1900s, wages in Denmark were just over half of what could be earned in America. The immigrants also contributed to a higher level of information by sending letters home to family and friends. These often caused local sensation and could result in severe cases of America fever. This was probably the case for William's mother Elsa, his younger sister Anne Charlotte Matilda, her husband Hans Christian Hansen, and their three children Jens, Anine Catherine, and Hansine Petrine Vilhelmine, who left Denmark on July 21, 1870, and journeyed to America, destined for Mankato. Although Mankato was a rapidly growing town, Chicago seemed more attractive, and William saw more and greater opportunities there. He traveled there in 1871 with Tora and William Jr., and the Hansen family, who had just arrived from Denmark, soon followed. But a massive catastrophe had struck the city. It was a fire in 1871 that began on Sunday evening, October 8th, and lasted until early Tuesday, October 10th. Hundreds perished, and the fire destroyed an area of 9 square kilometers of the city. Although the fire was one of the greatest American disasters of the 19th century, the rebuilding transformed Chicago into one of the most populous and economically significant American metropolises. The fire, as mentioned, started on October 8th around 9 p.m., near or in a small barn behind 137 DeKoven Street in the southwestern part of the city. Rumors suggested the fire started when a cow kicked over a lit lantern in the barn, owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, but they denied the accusation, and the true cause of the fire was never determined. What is certain is that it quickly got out of control and spread rapidly toward the city center in a northerly and easterly direction. Michael Ahern, a journalist at the Chicago Republican newspaper, admitted in 1893 that he had fabricated the story about O'Leary because the barn was the first building the fire destroyed. The fire was fueled by Chicago's wooden structures, pre-fire drought, and strong southwest winds that blew embers toward the city center. More than 2/3 of Chicago's buildings were made of wood and treated with flammable tar or had wooden roofs, and exterior decorations were also made of wood. Most of the city's architects in Chicago had designed the wooden buildings to resemble other building materials. Sidewalks and roads were also made of planks. The city responded very slowly, and the residents initially didn't realize the danger. As the summer of 1871 had been extremely dry, fires broke out all over the region, and the day before the Chicago disaster, a major fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, just 200 kilometers north of Chicago, leveled 4 square kilometers and killed at least 1,200 people, making it the deadliest fire in American history. 2 billion trees also burned, an event bordering on the unimaginable. After the Chicago fire died down, the embers were still too hot for several days to assess the damage. Authorities determined that an area 6 kilometers long and on average 1.2 kilometers wide, more than 9 square kilometers had been lost. Over 117 kilometers of roads, 190 kilometers of sidewalks, 2,000 streetlights, and 17,500 buildings were destroyed, along with properties worth $222 million, constituting about 1/3 of Chicago's value, and between 2 to 3 million books in private libraries were obliterated. Out of a population of 300,000, 100,000 had become homeless. The fire caused more damage to the major newspaper, the Chicago Daily Tribune, than Napoleon's occupation of Moscow in 1812. And the catastrophe also led to looting and lawlessness, necessitating the intervention of the military. After the fire, 125 fatalities were found. It is estimated that 200 to 300 people died in the fire, which is relatively few considering the extent of the fire. The Great Chicago Fire is the city's most talked about disaster, both due to the scale of destruction and the city's rebuilding and growth. In 1997, Chicago's City Council exonerated the Irish immigrant Catherine O'Leary, who had died in 1895, in her cow. William, Thora, and William Jr. settled on Milwaukee Avenue, where William partnered with the Dane Peter Christian Jensen, known as Johnson, and together they opened the store Harlev & Johnson, Milwaukee Avenue Bazaar, a manufacturer and retailer of clothing and suitcases, home furnishings, hats, caps, and much more. The two gentlemen did really well. Harlev had imaginative and advanced ideas in the advertising field. His advertisements were original as well as topical. Here's an example of an ad that was published on the day of a solar eclipse.
Despite the solar eclipse today, Harlev shirts will shine with their usual whiteness.
A tragedy would strike the small family. In the newspaper, it was reported that William's wife, Thora, on the evening of June 15, 1872, at 8:30 p.m., was hit by an express wagon outside her house on Milwaukee Avenue. She was immediately taken into her residence, where she died from her injuries within an hour. The wagon belonged to Shriven and Joss and was driven by John Joss himself, who after the accident jumped off the wagon and fled. John Joss was arrested the following morning, but after questioning witnesses, he was not held responsible for the accident and was released. Life had to go on, and work had to be attended to. Just as the city grew and developed after the fire, so did William and Christian's business, and soon they opened another store at 109 West Indiana Street, primarily selling clothing. Just like William, his mother, younger sister, and hers family, William's younger brother Jens Peter made the same decision and departed in 1873 with his family. With him, he had his wife Maren and their 5 daughters Catherine, Wilhelmina, Anna Margrethe, Thora, and Christine. Jens Peter, who worked as a wheelwright in Denmark, started working for William in his store on West Indiana Street, but soon returned to his old profession as a wagon maker on California Avenue, north of Bloomingdale Avenue. Jens Peter is the one standing on the right, wearing the black hat and leaning against the wheel in the picture. But Jens Peter already died in 1897, only 57 years old, leaving behind not only his wife Maren, but also the 5 daughters they brought from Denmark, as well as 3 additional daughters, Mary, Julia, and Elizabeth, born in Chicago.